Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Today is the 16th day of Adar. Now, as you know, Purim is on the 14th of Adar, which was Friday. But the people of Jerusalem, the walled city of Jerusalem, they always celebrate on the 15th. Because if you study the Megillah, in the time of Mordechai and Esther, the Jews in Shushan asked for an extra day to fend off their enemies because Shushan was permeated with extra hate towards the Jews. And they only rested not on the 14th, but on the 15th. So usually they celebrate on the 15th in Jerusalem in the walled city. And many people from Israel, from other places come. They celebrate in their own cities on the 14th. And they celebrate in Jerusalem on the 15th. So they get 2 days instead of one. But this year is different. It's called the Trifecta Purim, the Yom Tov HaMeshulash, the threefold Purim. Why? Because we celebrated on Friday. Now, the people in Jerusalem should have celebrated on Shabbat, but they can't because you don't celebrate Purim on Shabbat. So they're celebrating Purim today. But although they're celebrating Purim today, they had the joy, although they couldn't do the gift baskets and the dressing up and all the Megillah reading yesterday. They celebrated yesterday. So we have what we call the Yom Tov HaMeshulash, the triple Purim. So I want to talk about Purim too. But I want to start with something else because it makes me think so much. Today is the 73rd yahrzeit of my beloved grandmother, Necha, Allah Shalom, who my dear daughter Necha is named after. And many of you have been to my home or have watched me on Facebook know that my grandmother was murdered by Jordanian terrorists in 1948 in March in front of my father in the city of Jerusalem. And in fact, throughout the years, how many times did my father tell me that till today he could remember vividly the shrapnel hitting her head and my grandmother saying Shema Yisrael in front of her 7-year-old son, and she was holding a baby, my uncle Pinchas, who survived and then passing. And I was thinking about this because here in Jerusalem, they're celebrating the most festive holiday today. Many years they celebrated on the 16th. And I imagine my dad at such a young age, right after coming from the most festive and joyous Jewish holiday of Purim, having to witness on a Shabbat, it happened on Shabbat, witness his mother being killed and butchered in front of him. And I think about it because today my father, Kanai Nahara, himself has 8 children and nearly 40 grandchildren. My grandmother had 12 children. She has hundreds of great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. And although we miss her very dearly, and my father will never forget that day, and that wound is still within him, when we commemorate her yahrzeit now, we also celebrate the life and the gifts she gave us, which connect to Purim. The fact that they want to annihilate us, they want to kill us, and sometimes they unfortunately kill some of us. But yet we never give up and we always continue. So I wanted to say a little thought about Purim because although we're in the diaspora, but we still, of course, our hearts and our souls and our minds are always in Jerusalem. And since today in Jerusalem they're celebrating Purim, so are we celebrating Purim. So there's 4 verses in the Megillah we say loud, even if we're not reading the Megillah. And the last one is the last verse of the Megillah. And it says like this. It says, Ki Mordechai Yehudi, because Mordechai the Jew, Mishnah LaMelech Achashverosh, was second in command to the king Achashverosh, and he was beloved by most of his brothers. He sought out good for his people, for the Jewish people. And he sought peace for all of his people. And the Rebbe, in a discussion in 1965, I think, if I remember, 1961, in a Farbrengen, late in the night, it was like probably 2 a.m. on Purim, the Rebbe asked a very famous question on this. First of all, why is this connected to the Megillah? What do we have to know that Mordechai, was second in command to Achashverosh? It's not a biography of Mordechai, and he was seeking out the welfare of his brothers. What's the point there? And secondly, why does it say he was beloved by most of his brothers? Wasn't he beloved? Why say this derogatory thing? Imagine if you want to date someone, And you say to me, Rabbi, what type of guy? You say, well, most people like him. And right away you have raised red flags. So what's the point? The Rebbe says that the message here is a very powerful one. And this is something that we have to think about. The Rebbe says that first of all, he says that wants to tell us that Mordechai was second in command to Achashverosh to remind us that although there was a miracle of Purim, the Jews were still in exile. There was no temple. There was no Jerusalem. They were under the tyrant in Persia, which technically till today we worry about. Iran is Persia. We worry about that tyrant till today. Secondly, you see, Mordechai, Rashi tells us, wasn't beloved by all his brothers. You know why? Because after Mordechai was the benefactor of such a great miracle, of the miracle of Purim, Mordechai was part of the Sanhedrin, the 71-seated Supreme Court justice of the Jewish people. And some of his brethren, some of the other rabbis felt that Mordechai, once the miracle happened, he should get back to the yeshiva. He was a rabbi, he was a teacher, he was a leader. Stay with the people and study. Why is he still running around the halls of Shushan? Why is he still focusing on diplomacy and politics and involved with the government? The miracle happened. But Mordechai understood that although now they overcame the crisis, they were still in exile. And if there's a way that you could be involved and impact the government for the benefit of your people, you always have to be there and always have to do this. And the Rebbe says that's the message. Mordechai was always cognizant that he was beloved by most of his brothers, not all. Because he always remembered that although he had to roam the halls of Shushan, he always remembered that ultimately that wasn't where he wanted to be. That wasn't where he should be. He was there as a sacrifice. And when you recognize that it's a sacrifice, then you do it. But you also remember where your soul is. Mordechai knew that his job was to always be there to protect Jews. And it took a toll. Some of his brothers didn't even like what he did and didn't agree with him. But he did it because he had no choice. And the last thing he says, Doresh Shalom L'chol Zara. At the end of the day, you have to seek out the welfare of your people. Sometimes they will agree with you. Sometimes they won't agree with you. But the power of a Jew, and Mordechai teaches us that you always roam the halls and always look after your brethren. Even when you think there's no crisis. We live in a time when there always could be a crisis. And that's why the Megillah ends with this, to teach us the power of Mordechai, of who he was, the sacrifices he made, and the vision he had to stay involved and influential. And the second in command, the prime minister under the king Pharaoh, under the king Achashverosh, say he could be there to impact his brothers. And even though some of his brothers were upset at him about it, he understood why. But he did the right thing. And this reminds me, I think last week, a 97-year-old man, I think his name was Shlomo Hillel. I'm not even remembering his first name, but he was a man who passed away at the age of 97 years old. And this man was born he lived in Ra'anana, but he was born to parents in Baghdad, in Iraq, in 1923. His name was Shlomo Hillel. And then in 1933, I think it was in 1938, there was a terrible massacre, a crusade against the Christians, and his parents thought if this is what could happen to the Christians, we're next, and they emigrated to Israel. Then in 1948, influenced by the Nazis and Nazism, there was one of the worst days for the Jews of Baghdad. Don't forget, 1 in 3 Jews in Baghdad. 1 in 3 people in Baghdad were Jews. And that night, in 1941, they went and there was a terrible pogrom against the Jews. And they butchered 500 Jews. Some of them were tortured with knives, with guns. And it became the worst thing for the Jewish people to live in Baghdad, even though there were so many Jews. Now, living in Israel, Shlomo Hillel, in 1943 or 44, his wife, Tamima, came from Europe on one of the boats that brought refugees. And he wanted so badly to be able to help his brothers in Baghdad. And he went back on a mission, disguised as an Arab, to Baghdad, where he taught people Hebrew, the Israelis, and he encouraged them to make Aliyah. And then he came back, but that wasn't enough. And after the war, he helped together with, they found an American pilot who loved flying and also wanted money, and they paid him. Through the Haganah, he joined the Haganah, which was defense before the state of Israel, to bring Jews over to Israel. And he was in the Haganah, and they paid this pilot to fly. They would leave Baghdad at night and come to Israel before morning, before dawn, and smuggle in the Jewish people from Baghdad before the British would wake up, because the British had quotas and they wouldn't let them in. And he did this for a long time. They got, I think, 12,000 Jews. And then eventually, of course, Israel went into a much larger campaign where they brought 120,000 Jews from Baghdad to live in Israel. But here you had a man, Shlomo Hillel, youngest of 11, who was in Israel already, was living a better life. But even when he was in Israel, he never doresh shalom l'chol zaro. He never forgot that he had a responsibility to his brothers. And he worked tirelessly for years in danger to be able to bring another Jew from Baghdad to be able to live in Israel in safety. And when you think about the Megillah of Mordechai going back 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, of course, 3,000 years ago nearly, and here you have this man who sought to bring his brothers and sisters to a place where they can live safely. And that's the power of Judaism. In Israel, they're celebrating, and therefore, since we're connected, we should all be celebrating. And I think about the soul of my grandmother. Her neshama should have an aliyah, and God should look after her family and avenge the blood that was spilled. And we should all have a good day. And happy Shushan Purim in Jerusalem. Have a great day.